His teacher never called on him until the day she decided to humiliate him in front of everyone. But when he started playing, the look on her face said it all. She never saw it coming. Elijah Rivers sat by the window, his pencil tapping a steady rhythm against the edge of his notebook. It wasn't nerves, just habit. The same one his mom always told him to quit, but it helped him think. The classroom at Jefferson Middle School in Little Rock buzzed with the usual chatter before lessons, but Elijah stayed focused on the worksheet in front of him. He liked finishing early. At the front, Miss Abigail Thornton reviewed her notes. After more than a dozen years teaching 6th grade, she had a reputation, strict but fair, though only to the kids she favored. Elijah was never one of them. She never shouted, never insulted him outright, but she rarely called on him, even when his hand was raised. When he got something correct, she rushed past it. If he slipped up, rare as that was, she lingered, almost savoring the mistake. Elijah noticed. So did some of his classmates. "She barely even sees you," Tyler Whitman whispered once, leaning over. "It's like you're invisible." Elijah had only shrugged. "Guess so," but today felt different. Miss Thornton's eyes landed on him more often than usual. Not with suspicion, but with something else. Expectation. The lesson began, a Civil War discussion. Elijah took notes, waiting for the usual pattern. Then, unexpectedly, Miss Thornton said sharply, "Why don't you answer this one?" Heads turned. Elijah straightened, scanning the board. General Sherman's march to the sea was meant to break the Confederacy's supplies and morale. She murmured, "Not bad, not bad." It was flawless, straight out of the textbook. A few students exchanged looks. Tyler shot him one that said, "What was that?" The lesson moved on, but something had shifted. She wasn't ignoring him anymore. She was watching, and just before the bell, she made her move. "Elijah," she said as kids stuffed their bags, "stay behind." A few glanced back, but no one spoke. Elijah packed up slowly and walked to her desk. "I overheard you the other day," she said, folding her hands, "talking about your grandfather." Elijah frowned. "What about him? You said he was a musician." Her tone made the room feel heavier. He nodded cautiously. "He was a pianist, played jazz." Miss Thornton's lips curved slightly, not quite a smirk, but close. "Interesting." She leaned back, tapping her fingers against the desk. "So you must have picked up something." Elijah hesitated. He didn't like where this was going. A little, he admitted. Her smile spread, though it carried no warmth. "Good to know." The bell rang. Elijah slung his bag over his shoulder, but her voice stopped him at the door. "Tomorrow, show us what you've got." He turned, eyebrows raised. She gestured toward the dusty upright piano shoved in the corner of the room. "You'll play something for the class." Elijah froze. A couple of students lingering near the doorway were now watching closely. He asked. Miss Thornton tilted her head, amused. "Why not? You said your grandfather played. I'm sure you have some of that talent in you." Elijah recognized that tone. It wasn't encouragement. It wasn't curiosity. It was a setup, but he wasn't going to back down. Elijah barely slept that night. He lay on his back staring at the ceiling, replaying every word Miss Thornton had said. This wasn't an invitation. It was a test, and he knew exactly the kind. She wanted him to trip up, to look small in front of everyone, to confirm whatever low expectations she already carried about him. But what she didn't know was that the story ran deeper. The next morning, when Elijah walked into the classroom, the air carried something heavier than usual. Word had spread. Whispers followed him as he slid into his seat. "You really going to play today?" Brandon Hall called out with a smirk. Elijah ignored him. Tyler leaned in quietly. "Didn't know you played piano." Elijah's pencil tapped against the page of his notebook. "There's a lot people don't know," he muttered. Miss Thornton entered, stacking her books neatly with a certain satisfaction in her posture. She barely acknowledged the chatter of students settling down, though her gaze lingered on Elijah longer than anyone else before she began the lesson. The first half of class crawled by, but Elijah couldn't hear much of it. His mind stayed fixed on the moment he knew was coming, and then it came. Miss Thornton shut her book with a crisp sound and glanced at the clock. "Well, we have a little extra time." "Perfect." She gestured toward the upright piano in the corner. "Elijah, why don't you show us what you can do?" The atmosphere shifted instantly. Chairs squeaked, students leaned forward, whispers rippled. Elijah didn't move at first. He could feel every eye waiting. His heartbeat wasn't racing, but it was steady, pounding with purpose. Slowly, he stood. A few muffled laughs rolled through the room as he walked to the piano. Someone muttered under their breath, but he didn't need to catch the words. He already knew the tone. Miss Thornton folded her hands together, voice cool. "Play anything you like." Elijah looked at the instrument. The keys were yellowed, a couple chipped along the edges. He ran his fingers across them lightly, out of tune, not terribly, but enough. He sat, inhaled deeply, and let his hands hover over the keys. He already knew exactly what piece he would play. Another snicker came from behind him. That sealed it. This wasn't just about proving Miss Thornton wrong anymore. It was about proving them all wrong. The room fell still. Students who had been whispering now leaned forward in silence. Even Miss Thornton's usual mask of smug composure cracked slightly, her brow furrowed, as if she wasn't sure what was coming. Elijah lowered his fingers, pressing into the keys. The first notes floated out, soft, deliberate, a blues progression, the kind his grandfather had once played for hours on sticky Arkansas evenings. His left hand set the rhythm, strong and steady, while his right danced the melody with a fluid ease that only came from years of practice. The mood in the room changed. Laughter stopped. Eyes widened. Kids who had smirked now sat frozen. Even Miss Thornton's arms folded tighter, her expression darkening with something she hadn't expected. Surprise. Elijah didn't glance at them. He wasn't playing for their approval. He was playing for himself, for the memory of his grandfather. For every moment he had been overlooked. He let himself fall deeper into the music, every note carrying a piece of a story only he could tell. His fingers moved fluidly, striking that perfect balance between control and feeling, between discipline and soul. It wasn't just him playing a piece. It was him speaking through the piano and the piano answering back. Then he pushed further, daring himself. He slid into something harder, more intricate, a run his grandfather had drilled into him, one that had once made his hands ache with frustration until he finally nailed it months later. His left hand thundered through a rolling bass line, while his right soared across the melody, weaving layers together, clashing, resolving, harmonizing like voices in conversation. The silence in the room grew thick, heavier with each measure, as though the music itself had wrapped the class in its grip. Nobody was laughing now. Tyler leaned forward, wide-eyed. Brandon sat stiff, arms crossed, the smirk wiped clean from his face. Other students traded looks, disbelief mingling with something closer to respect. And then came the crescendo. Elijah's hands struck hard, chords reverberating through the room, the melody cresting like a wave before crashing into the final run. He poured everything into it, the slights, the doubts, the invisibility, until the last note hung suspended, trembling in the air, then faded into nothing. Silence. Elijah's hands dropped into his lap, his chest rising and falling. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then one clap sharp from the back. Another joined, then more. Within moments, the whole class was clapping, the sound rising like a tide. Tyler let out a whistle. Even Brandon, stubborn as ever, shook his head slowly. I didn't know he could do that. Elijah exhaled, his pulse heavy, not from nerves, but from the release, from the power of what he had just claimed. This wasn't just music, it was proof. The applause swelled, students staring at each other like they had witnessed something rare, something unforgettable. But one silence still cut through it all. Miss Thornton's. She hadn't moved. She stood stiff behind her desk, arms crossed, lips pressed in a hard line, her face unreadable. The room clapped around her, but she stayed still. Elijah didn't smile, didn't ask for anything. He just sat, hands folded, letting the moment stretch. Finally, Miss Thornton's voice sliced through. Well, she said, clipped and cool. That was unexpected. The clapping faltered, fading into awkward quiet as students shifted in their seats. Some still whispered, buzzed from the moment, but the energy had changed. It wasn't a joke anymore. Where did you learn to play like that? She asked, her head tilting slightly. Elijah's eyes didn't flinch. My grandfather. Something flickered in her face, regret, surprise, maybe even respect, but it was gone before anyone could name it. She straightened, I see. She tapped her fingers against the desk, the sound sharp in the quiet. Then, with a quick sweep of her gaze, she turned back to the class. Let's continue. But the students didn't move. Tyler was still staring at Elijah like he had never really seen him before. Madison Green in the back looked irritated, as though the moment had been cut short, stolen away too soon. Brandon scoffed under his breath. That's it. Miss Thornton's eyes snapped to him. Excuse me. Brandon lifted his hands, shrugging. I mean, that's all you've got to say? He just played like. He gestured helplessly, unable to find the words. Like something you'd hear on TV, and you're just going to brush past it. Brandon said, his tone incredulous. A few heads nodded in agreement, the quiet support spreading like sparks. Miss Thornton's lips pressed into a thin line. This is a classroom, not a talent show. Elijah drew in a slow breath, steady. You didn't think I could play, did you? Her eyes snapped to him, sharp and guarded, but he didn't look away. That's why you called me up here. A ripple of whispers passed through the room. Miss Thornton inhaled through her nose. I simply gave you a chance to share your gift with the class. Elijah shook his head, his tone calm but firm. No, you didn't. You thought I'd fail. That's why you asked. The whispers grew. Miss Thornton's hand flexed against the edge of her desk. That's enough, Elijah, but he wasn't finished. You wouldn't have asked Tyler or Madison or Brandon, but you asked me. The room held its breath, every pair of eyes fixed on the exchange. Miss Thornton's jaw clenched. You are out of line. Elijah's voice didn't waver. I don't think I am. Her expression darkened, her spine rigid. Sit down. For the first time all year, Elijah didn't move right away. He let the silence hang, heavy and electric, then looked around at the classmates who had ignored him, underestimated him, laughed when she singled him out. Slowly, deliberately, he turned and walked back to his desk. The room felt different now. Miss Thornton wasn't the center anymore. He was. His steps were steady, his heartbeat calm, almost weightless as he sat back down. Tyler gave him a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement. Madison crossed her arms, still staring at Miss Thornton like she was waiting for something more, but Miss Thornton had turned away. She opened her lesson plan, eyes fixed, like nothing had happened. Let's continue. But the air didn't snap back to normal. Whispers lingered, the current of unease still strong. Brandon leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Kinda weird though, isn't it? You made such a big deal out of him playing, and now you don't want to talk about it. Miss Thornton's head shot up. Excuse me? Brandon shrugged. I'm just saying. You pushed him into it, and now you're acting like it didn't matter. A soft hum of agreement moved through the class. Miss Thornton's grip tightened around her book. That's enough. But the crack was already there, and everyone saw it. For the rest of the period, her control felt fragile, like glass with a hairline fracture. She still went through the motions of teaching, but the usual authority wasn't there. The rhythm was broken. When the bell rang, the scraping of chairs and the low chatter carried an edge. Students filed out in groups, still murmuring. Elijah swung his bag over his shoulder and headed for the door. Just before he stepped through, Miss Thornton's voice called out. Elijah, he turned. For a flicker of a second, it seemed like she might actually say something real, something honest. But then her expression hardened again. Remember, this is still my classroom. Elijah studied her, calm and unwavering. I know, he said simply. A beat of silence stretched between them before he turned and walked out. In the hallway, Tyler jogged to catch up. What was that? He shook his head, grinning in disbelief. You just flipped everything upside down. Elijah let out a breath. Yeah, Tyler nudged his shoulder. So you gonna play again? Elijah thought about it, the weight of the keys under his fingers. The way the room had shifted when the music filled the air. A smile tugged at his lips. Yeah, I think I will, because what happened that day wasn't just him playing notes. For the first time, he had been heard. He walked home that afternoon lighter than he had in months, the sun dropping low over West Markham Street, stretching shadows across the sidewalk. The tension he'd carried since yesterday, the doubt, the invisibility, was gone. At the corner store near his block, he stopped for a bottle of water. Mr. Henson, the shop owner with silver hair and sharp eyes, gave him a look. You look like a kid who just did something big. Elijah paused, then grinned. Maybe I did. By the time he reached his front door, the smell of fried catfish and cornbread drifted through the air. His mother stood at the stove, humming softly as she flipped a fillet in the pan. "You're late," she said. Elijah dropped his bag by the door and sank into a chair. "Long day." She glanced at him. Good or bad? He thought about it. The silence in the classroom. The way Miss Thornton's face had shifted. The way his classmates had really seen him. He said finally, "Really good." She turned off the stove, wiped her hands on a towel, and sat across from him. "Want to talk about it?" Elijah nodded, and for 15 minutes he told her everything. She didn't interrupt, didn't push. She just listened, her face shifting between concern, pride, and something softer, something almost sad. When he finished, she exhaled. "Sounds like you made her uncomfortable." Elijah nodded. "I think I did." She studied him for a moment. "And how does that feel?" He didn't even have to think, like it was supposed to happen. She reached across the table, squeezing his hand with a proud smile. The next morning at school, the world looked the same, but something under the surface had shifted. Miss Thornton still taught the same way, still favored the same students, still carried herself like nothing had happened. But her control felt thinner. People saw her differently, and they saw Elijah differently too. At lunch, a few students who had never spoken to him before slid over. "Dude, you were insane on that piano," Madison said, plopping down across from him. "How long you been playing?" "Since I was 5. Tyler shook his head. "Man, you've been keeping secrets." Elijah smirked. "Guess so." Across the cafeteria, Miss Thornton passed by with a tray. For a second, their eyes met. This time, she was the one who looked away. Elijah just kept eating. He didn't need to say anything else, because some lessons don't come from textbooks. Some moments rewrite the way people see the world, even when they don't admit it. Miss Thornton had spent the year pretending Elijah didn't exist, and in just a few minutes, he had made sure she'd never forget him again. Maybe she'd never acknowledge it. Maybe she'd never confess what she'd assumed. But that didn't matter, because Elijah knew something now, something she didn't. When people try to silence you, when they try to shrink you, the best thing you can do is let your talent drown out their doubts. And when you do, they won't have a choice but to listen. If this story made you stop and think, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us to stand tall, no matter who's watching.